It was supposed to be a face-off like any other, a routine stare-down to promote a fight. Instead, it erupted into chaos. Cameras rolled as Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier brawled in front of shocked reporters, a scuffle that spilled off the stage and onto the evening news. For many, that was the first glimpse of how deep their hatred ran. But the truth is, the fire between these two men started long before fists flew in a press room. One was the youngest champion in UFC history, a gifted prodigy whose talent seemed limitless. The other, an Olympic wrestler turned late-blooming MMA star, whose grit and discipline carried him to the elite ranks. On paper, they were destined to be rivals. In reality, they became enemies, locked in one of the ugliest, most personal feuds the sport has ever seen. This is the story of Jon Jones versus Daniel Cormier, a rivalry that defined an era of the UFC. Before Daniel Cormier ever stepped into the UFC's light heavyweight division, Jon Jones was already its ruler. He wasn't just winning fights, he was redefining how they could be won. From the moment he stepped into the octagon in 2008, Jones looked like something the sport had never seen before. At 6'4", with an 84-inch reach, he possessed freakish physical gifts. But it wasn't just the body, it was what he did with it. Spinning elbows, oblique kicks, creative clinch work. Jones didn't fight by the book, he rewrote the book. By 2011, at just 23 years old, he became the youngest champion in UFC history after dismantling Mauricio "Shogun" Rua. He made it look easy, and that became his trademark. Hall of Famers like Lyoto Machida, Rashad Evans, and Vitor Belfort all fell in his path, and each time, Jones left the cage looking untouchable. The MMA world called him a prodigy, a generational talent destined to go down as the greatest fighter of all time. But beneath the polished highlights and media praise, there was another side to Jon Jones. Teammates whispered about his arrogance in training. Opponents noticed the smirk in his stare-downs, a subtle hint that he didn't just want to beat them, he wanted to belittle them. And outside the cage, there were early signs of recklessness, late-night parties, brushes with the law, and an attitude that seemed to clash with the discipline the sport demanded. Still, talent forgives a lot in MMA, and as long as he kept winning, Jones's flaws were overlooked. He was the UFC's golden boy, the perfect combination of charisma and dominance. Fans were drawn to him because he was unpredictable, and opponents were intimidated because they couldn't find weaknesses. But the same traits that made him unbeatable inside the cage, his supreme confidence, his belief that he could break anyone, would soon collide with another fighter cut from a completely different cloth. A man who represented everything Jones didn't. A man who wouldn't be intimidated, wouldn't be broken, and wouldn't back down. That man was Daniel Cormier. While Jon Jones was hailed as a prodigy, Daniel Cormier's story was one of grit, perseverance, and tragedy. Born in Lafayette, Louisiana, Cormier faced hardship from the start. His father was murdered when Daniel was just 7 years old, and wrestling became his escape. It was a sport where discipline, not flash, determined greatness, and Cormier excelled. By the late 1990s, he was one of America's brightest wrestling prospects. He represented the United States at the 2004 and 2008 Olympics, becoming team captain. But destiny was cruel. In 2004, he fell short of a medal. In 2008, after years of sacrifice, he was forced to withdraw due to severe weight-cutting complications that left him hospitalized. His Olympic dream was shattered, and many assumed his athletic career was over. But Cormier refused to quit. He turned to mixed martial arts in his 30s, an age when most fighters are past their prime. Training out of American Kickboxing Academy alongside legends like Cain Velasquez and Luke Rockhold, Cormier discovered he had more to offer than wrestling. His hands developed, his cage IQ sharpened, and his relentless pace broke opponents. At heavyweight, he ran through the Strikeforce Grand Prix, defeating men much larger than him. When he transitioned to the UFC, he was undefeated, carving a path of destruction. But there was one problem. His teammate Cain Velasquez was the heavyweight champion, and Cormier's loyalty meant he wouldn't challenge him. So he dropped to light heavyweight, chasing gold in a division already ruled by Jon Jones. Cormier's personality stood in sharp contrast to Jones. He was disciplined, humble, a family man who prided himself on hard work and respect. He wasn't the prodigy, he was the grinder. Fans related to his story because it was built on resilience. He'd endured heartbreak, loss, and setback, but he always came back stronger. And in Jon Jones, Cormier saw not only the man standing standing between him and the belt, but everything he disliked about the fight game. Arrogance, recklessness, disrespect. From the start, their values clashed, and once their paths crossed, dislike turned into disdain. Their rivalry didn't ignite inside the cage, it began behind it. The first time Jones and Cormier met, there were no cameras, no press, no microphones. It was a casual backstage conversation, but it planted the seed of a feud that would spiral out of control. Cormier later recalled how Jones approached him, already the light heavyweight king, and with a grin said something along the lines of, "I bet I could take you down." To most, it might have been harmless trash talk, but to an Olympic wrestler like Cormier, it was an insult. Wrestling was his domain, his pride, the one arena where he knew he was untouchable. For Jones to joke about beating him at his own game wasn't just arrogance, it was disrespect. From that day forward, Cormier viewed Jones differently. He saw him not as a rival to admire, but as an egotist who needed humbling. Jones, for his part, seemed amused by Cormier's intensity. He thrived on getting under people's skin, and Cormier's fiery reactions only fed his confidence. As Cormier climbed the light heavyweight ladder, dispatching opponents with ease, the collision course became inevitable. Every post-fight interview, every UFC promo teased the clash between the young champion and the Olympic veteran. Fans began to sense the animosity bubbling beneath the surface, but it wasn't until the microphones were turned on, until the cameras were rolling, that the rivalry truly exploded. Because Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier didn't just want to beat each other, they wanted to humiliate each other. And the first public eruption would happen not in the octagon, but on a press conference stage in front of the entire world. The rivalry between Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier boiled over in August 2014 at a UFC 178 press conference in Las Vegas. What was supposed to be a routine media event turned into one of the most infamous moments in UFC history, played on repeat across ESPN and mainstream outlets around the world. It started with a face-off. Jones and Cormier stood nose-to-nose on stage, the crowd buzzing with anticipation. For a few tense seconds, neither man moved. Then, Jones pressed his forehead hard against Cormier's. It was a show of dominance, a psychological ploy Jones had used before, but this time, Cormier wasn't having it. He shoved Jones backward with both hands. In an instant, the stage exploded. Jones lunged at Cormier, throwing punches as UFC staff and security scrambled to separate them. The backdrop collapsed. Officials stumbled, and fans screamed in disbelief. Suits were ripped, shoes were lost, and the two fighters had to be dragged apart as they shouted threats across the chaos. The fallout was immediate. The Nevada State Athletic Commission fined both men, ordered community service, and condemned the outburst as unprofessional. But for the UFC, the brawl was promotional gold. The video went viral, drawing millions of views online. Suddenly, Jones versus Cormier wasn't just another title fight, it was personal, it was violent, and it was must-see TV. In the days that followed, both men doubled down on their hatred. Cormier called Jones fake, a man who played the role of a clean-cut champion but was arrogant and cruel behind the scenes. Jones, caught in a hot mic moment on ESPN, snarled that he would literally kill Cormier. The clip leaked, shocking fans and confirming just how deep the animosity ran. The stage was set. No amount of fines or warnings could douse the fire. This wasn't about belts anymore. This was about pride, about legacy, and about two men who genuinely wanted to destroy each other. The countdown to their first fight had begun. On January 3rd, 2015, the feud finally moved from the press stage to the octagon. UFC 182, Jon Jones vs. Daniel Cormier was billed as one of the biggest grudge matches in UFC history, and the atmosphere inside the MGM Grand Garden Arena was electric. Cormier walked to the cage first, his eyes burning with determination. For him, this was more than a title shot. It was the culmination of years of sacrifice, the chance to prove that discipline and hard work could topple raw talent and arrogance. Jones followed, calm, confident, smirking as if he already knew the outcome. The fight itself was brutal and exhausting. From the opening round, Cormier pressed forward, trying to close the distance and impose his wrestling. Jones answered with his trademark elbows, kicks, and long strikes. The clinch exchanges were fierce, with Jones landing knees and Cormier responding with short uppercuts. For 3 rounds, it was competitive, with both men refusing to give an inch. But as the fight wore on, Jones's pace, creativity, and length began to overwhelm Cormier. He stuffed takedowns, landed damaging shots, and even took Cormier down himself, something few thought possible. By the fourth and fifth rounds, Cormier was visibly tired, his punches slower, his movement heavier. Jones, sensing victory, pressed the action and controlled the final exchanges. When the final horn sounded, the judges were unanimous. Jon Jones retained his title by decision. He raised his hands, grinning, while Cormier lowered his head, devastated. All the years of work, all the talk of destiny, had ended in bitter disappointment. In the post-fight interview, Jones twisted the knife, mocking Cormier and dismissing his effort. Cormier, emotional, admitted he had lost to the better man that night, but promised he would be back. For fans, it was clear this rivalry wasn't over. If anything, the fire was only beginning to burn hotter. After UFC 182, the war between Jones and Cormier didn't slow down. It escalated. The fight may have ended, but the feud had only grown more personal. In interviews, Cormier called Jones the worst person I've ever been around, describing him as fake and manipulative. He contrasted his own life, family man, coach, broadcaster, with Jones's reckless reputation. For Cormier, the fight had gone beyond titles. It was now about exposing Jones as a fraud, a man unworthy of the spotlight he held. Jones, for his part, leaned into the villain role. He mocked Cormier's emotions, replaying clips of him crying after the fight. He boasted that he had beaten Cormier at his own game, taking him down when no one thought it possible. He sneered at Cormier's attempts to position himself as a role model, claiming it was all envy. Then came the scandals. Jones's personal life spiraled. In 2015, he was stripped of his title after a hit-and-run incident that left a pregnant woman injured. He tested positive for banned substances multiple times, leading to suspensions that derailed his career. Each controversy gave Cormier more ammunition, more reason to argue that Jones was unfit to be champion. But Jones's talent was undeniable. Every time he fought, he won. And every time he won, he reminded Cormier and the world that inside the cage, he was still king. For Cormier, this was maddening. He became champion in Jones's absence, but critics branded him a paper champ, saying he only wore the belt because Jones had been stripped. The insults became nastier. Families were mentioned. Careers were belittled. On live television, in backstage interviews, on Twitter, wherever they crossed paths, Jones and Cormier tore into each other. It was no longer about respect or even hatred. It was obsession. And the UFC, sensing the magnitude of the feud, knew there had to be a rematch. The world demanded it. And when they finally met again, the chaos reached its absolute peak. They'd been booked and yanked so many times, UFC 197, UFC 200, that by July 29, 2017, the rematch felt cursed, like fate kept tugging the cord just before the curtain rose. Yet in Anaheim, the curtain finally lifted. Cormier marched first, jaw set, a lifetime of Olympic heartbreak and UFC near misses condensed into a single walk. Jones followed with that familiar calm, the prodigy intent on reclaiming a throne he'd vacated with his own hands, and the stage felt too small for how much hate it was holding, which is exactly why nobody dared blink. The opening minutes were chess with fists. Jones worked long kicks to the body and legs, pawing frames and feints that pulled DC into traps. Cormier answered with dirty boxing in the clinch, snapping uppercuts that made the champion grin through his mouthpiece, because the pain told him the plan was working even as it stung. The pace built in layers: tease the head, batter the body, hide the left high kick behind calf kicks and fingertip, while DC hunted tie-ups and trips that could tilt the geometry of the fight, because geometry is how wrestlers break kings, and DC still believed in geometry, which kept the crowd murmuring. Then came the sequence that branded itself into rivalry folklore. Jones dipped to the body again. DC's hands dropped just a beat, and the left shin wrapped around Cormier's temple, like a door slamming shut on an old argument. DC staggered backward, reaching for a world suddenly tilted. Jones swarmed with hooks and knees. The ref waved it off, and the arena detonated into a sound you feel more than hear, because catharsis always arrives as thunder, and this one felt overdue. In the post-fight mic glow, Jones played maestro. He praised Cormier, called him a model father and competitor, then pivoted to Brock Lesnar with a showman's wink, because even redemption is marketing in this sport, and nobody understood that better than Jones when the lights were hottest, which made the moment feel final. Cormier, dazed and heartbroken, stood with tears he couldn't hide. Joe Rogan later apologized for interviewing him concussed. The champ who'd fought like a father brother defending a fence now stared through lights that wouldn't dim, and the internet didn't know whether to cheer or go quiet, which it never does. And then the ground shifted. Days later, news broke. An adverse drug test for Jones tied to a banned substance. The KO was overturned to a no contest, the belt returned to Cormier, and the sport whiplashed from closure to chaos in a single headline that split fans into camps with receipts and rationalizations because legacies don't fracture cleanly. Jones insisted he wasn't a cheater. DC insisted a tainted win is no win at all. And the rematch that seemed to answer everything suddenly asked more questions than it solved, which is why the rivalry still burned. For Cormier, the reversal was relief laced with sorrow. You don't unfeel a head kick. You don't unshed those tears. You just keep living with them, which is a different kind of belt. For Jones, it was another detour through the same dark tunnel. Greatness, scandal, suspension, because talent and turbulence had become twin rails of the same runaway train, and no one knew where it stopped next, which is exactly what kept everyone watching. After 214, the feud escaped simple binaries. Who's the better fighter? Who's the better man? The questions forked, because the sport refuses neat answers when reputations and test results collide, which is why the next chapter felt like parallel biographies written in different inks. Cormier doubled down on discipline. He defended his reclaimed light heavyweight title, then climbed to heavyweight and shocked Stipe Miocic with a short right hand and a lifetime of clinch wisdom, becoming a two-division champion because the grind still pays if you keep grinding. He defended against Derek Lewis, wore two belts like a thesis on resilience, then lost the heavyweight crown back to Stipe and fell short in the trilogy, which hurt in the quiet ways losses do, but never erased the pages he'd written, because legacy reads the whole book. Jones resurfaced at the end of 2018, beating Alexander Gustafsson for the vacant light heavyweight belt with cold, methodical violence, as if to say the throne never left, it just waited. He defended against Anthony Smith, then Thiago Santos on shredded knees, then edged Dominic Reyes in a fight that spawned 1,000 scorecards, because dominance is never dominant enough for the internet. The outside the cage headlines never stopped chasing him, but inside the cage, the calculus stayed the same. Unpredictability, reach, fight IQ, ingredients that make great fighters look ordinary, which is why the GOAT debates kept circling back to the same name even when the news didn't want to. Their media lives overlapped on studio desks and commentary headsets, the rivalry simmering just beneath polite smiles. There were barbed exchanges on broadcasts, clipped nods on red carpets, obligatory congratulations inked with subtext, because some grudges don't die, they evolve. DC leaned into mentorship and analysis, a teacher with scar tissue for curriculum. Jones talked New Horizons, flirted with heavyweight, then finally took it and won gold again, proving that reinvention is just ambition with patience, which not everyone owns. Fans kept litigating. If Jones is the greatest in-cage technician, where do the suspensions fit? If DC is the model champion, what does it mean that Jones beat him? Until he didn't. On paper, the feud became a mirror. People used to argue about what sports should value: results, rules, or role models, and mirrors always show more about the viewer than the subject, which is why the comment threads looked like philosophy with uppercuts. Meanwhile, the men changed because men do. Cormier retired with a Hall of Fame plaque and a broadcasting career that turned fight nights into seminars wrapped in jokes, because knowledge lands better with a grin. Jones migrated to heavyweight and claimed an empire that didn't forgive rust, because timing bends for certain talents, and those talents make their own calendars, which is why the questions never stop. Yet even as their paths diverged, the gravitational field between their names held. Footage of the brawl still opens hype packages. Clips of the head kick and the no contest ticker still live rent-free in fan memory. Interviews still drift toward what does Jones mean to your legacy and what does DC mean to yours? Because rivalry is a story engine that never runs out of gas, which is why producers keep the keys handy. And somewhere in the background, an unasked question kept humming. If circumstances were different, clean slates, clean tests, clean timelines, what would the ledger read? And would either of them accept it? Which is exactly the kind of question that refuses to sit still. Strip away the noise, and you're left with archetypes that made this feud immortal. Prodigy versus grinder, chaos versus order, mercurial genius versus disciplined permanence. Jones and Cormier weren't just opponents, they were foils, each man's strength shining a spotlight on the other's vulnerabilities, which is why the story endures even when the fights are over. For some, Jones is the most gifted mixed martial artist ever to lace 4-ounce gloves, a creator of solutions in real time whose only true rival was himself, which is the most tragic and magnetic narrative in sports. For others, Cormier is the conscience of an era, the champion, who did everything right in a sport that rarely rewards doing everything right, which is why his losses read like lessons and his wins feel like parables. Their exchanges rewired how the UFC sells animosity. The MGM melee drew a mainstream eye. The hot mic threat tore the mask off performative trash talk. The overturned KO forced an audience to wrestle with victory, defeat, and the thin membrane between them, which is a lot to ask of an audience craving simple winners. The rivalry proved that belts are props until men give them meaning, and meaning arrives through pain, risk, and the courage to be publicly imperfect, which both of them were in wildly different ways. Time has sanded some edges, but not all. There are handshakes now and occasional compliments, toned with the stiffness of two men who understand they helped build each other's legends, because iron sharpens iron and also leaves scratches. They'll share stages at ceremonies, trade analysis on air, maybe even laugh at the absurdity of their wildest moment. But under it all lies an unresolved chord you can still hear if you listen, which is what keeps highlight reels alive. Ask 10 fans who won the rivalry, and you'll get 11 answers. Some point to Jones's head-to-head supremacy, others circle the no contest and raise an eyebrow. Still others argue that legacy isn't only about nights under lights, it's about the days between them, which is a scoreboard nobody can tally cleanly. What's undeniable is this: both men reached higher because the other existed, and that's the quiet definition of greatness, which tends to whisper after the shouting stop. Will they ever fight again? Almost certainly not. They've moved into different seasons, one teaching, one conquering new terrain, and yet the thought experiment refuses to retire. Jones at heavyweight against DC's heavyweight geometry, clean camps and clean headlines, best of 5 in an empty gym where only truth keeps score, which is how dreamers think when history leaves a door cracked. So the legacy lands here. 2 careers braided by conflict, 2 fan bases forged by conviction, and a rivalry that turned a sport into a saga. Jones versus Cormier isn't just remembered, it's referenced, rewatched, re-argued, because it asked bigger questions than any belt could answer, which is why, years later, the credits still refuse to roll.